A photo leads a black and white trail to a hungry bridge. A surly bus driver picks up a mysterious passenger. Puddles ripple the minds of siblings seeking answers from their father. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. Oh, look at you. Well, you'll never make it. Sorry, kid, you did what you could, but your story ends here. Don't look at me like that. This is a mercy, and you know it. It's all right. I'll make it quick. With that, the misshapen young cookie, still dough on a tray, was scooped into Lee's mouth. It was delicious. How many is that? His mother's voice asked as she walked in. It would have been rude to talk with his mouth full, so Lee put the tray into the oven without answering. The question wasn't unfair. No batch of cookies ever made it into the oven without early casualties. He wondered if he'd hear about the perils of uncooked eggs for the 1,000th time, or maybe another super supportive comment not at all designed to make him feel guilty about his weight. Take him out in 10, Lee started. 10 minutes, I know, Mother interrupted. Are you going to the park again? Lee suppressed a cringe. He hated being interrupted. Hated it. And he got that from his mother. God help anybody who ever interrupted her. Lee couldn't decide which part of that was more annoying, so instead he mainly felt ashamed about being so predictable. I got a photography assignment. It's pretty there around now. There's still good light, he mumbled. Why he felt compelled to make excuses to go outside and do his homework, things mothers begged their teenage kids to do, he couldn't say. But he'd spoken long enough to grab his backpack and get to the door. Along his short walk to Hidden Oaks, Lee's mind had several occasions to drift, allowing his mindful gait to slouch into a natural but not particularly attractive waddle. It never took long for him to notice and remember to walk correctly, but it never took long to become distracted again, either. Lee's imagination brought him no end of joy and no end of embarrassment. To be caught talking to cookies as if they were soldiers, well, this time it was harmless and silly at least. The only one who saw already treated him like a child anyway. There were worse places and times to get wrapped up in one's own waking dreams. Ever since he could remember, Lee loved Hidden Oaks Park. The air was fresh, the plants and mushrooms and animals were fun to look at, to watch, to draw. In the park, he could just be a kid in a park. There were no additional expectations. It even made his mother talk less, probably just by being in public. Even schoolwork was more fun there. He could watch ants marching and imagine them to be engaged in elaborate trade networks, just like the Dutch East India Company from history class. He could see little sprouts with more curved or less curved leaves and wonder if that was because of those recessive and dominant genes from biology. He knew well his wandering mind and vivid imagination could be helpful. He just wished he could switch it all off sometimes. Daydreaming about daydreaming, of all things. Lee corrected his walking posture and dug out his assignment and camera. Light and shadow. The first picture would be easy. Anywhere and everywhere a person could look in Hidden Oaks, they'd see light and shadow. Even out in the field, looking straight up into the sky, there would still be brighter and darker areas, but it was always risky to try something clever, something he might have to explain. Better to find some indisputable light and shadow, and quickly he did. A very long, full, and heavy branch drooped so low it nearly touched the ground. Bunches of bright leaves bowing down to try and reach their own shadows. Just a bit more and the tiny soldiers running to the fringes could grab hold and build their bridge. Lee blinked hard to shake off his imaginary war stories. Distance. Motion. Lee carried on with the assignment. It wasn't much different than cooking, really. Ingredients, brought together in the right way, each ingredient was also whole in its own right. Butter had a recipe, and so did lard. In some cases, one might be used to substitute another. It was the same with taking pictures, or with anything for that matter. The whole world was a combination of ingredients, which included the park, which at that moment, including Lee himself, who in turn included the cookie who hadn't made it into the oven, and on and on. Crap, Lee thought to himself, and corrected his waddle. Lee was still unsure about photography class. He loved to tell stories and capture moments, but he never thought his pictures quite did the job. In his mind, he'd have a compelling scene full of texture and emotion, but by the time he went through all the work in the darkroom and had his prints, he usually felt let down. Even when Mrs. Jenkins praised one of his photos or showed it to the class as some great example, in Lee's mind, the image just wouldn't have the life he'd hoped for. Maybe it was due to always being black and white. Maybe the framing had been a little different in the viewfinder. Maybe the developing chemicals had been overused, or maybe those were all just excuses. He hated being the kid who would always make excuses for himself, even if they were legitimate. Perhaps especially then. Silhouette. Contrast. Whether or not any of these turned out, Lee was glad to be in the park. Glad to be away from home. No spotlight, no performance. Not that performance didn't have its moments. His own shadow was being cast up the small hill before him, a fine show of contrast if ever there was one. But what pose to assume? Was the shadow climbing the hill like Mount Everest? No. He would still need to look through the camera. He could hold it in one hand, extend his other arm, and pull up one leg so that his shadow was taking a sobriety test. That would get some laughs. Would this work better for light and shadow? How was that even different from contrast? Maybe he was overthinking again. It was only an assignment. Finally, reflection. Lee knew just the place. He'd concocted more stories about the pond and its island than any other feature of the park. Lately, anytime he caught his imagination running wild, he'd feel very childish. But this spot was a mixture of inspiration and seclusion which seemed to repel all flavors of shame. It had been a moated fortress, a deserted isle in endless ocean, a giant horse's hoofprint, a speedboat raceway. Today he thought it could certainly manage to serve as an example of reflection. It was pretty still, which should make things nice and clear. And indeed, the water and the reflections in it looked great. Lee quickly took 5 photos, each from a few yards apart, finishing off the roll. What he saw and what he hoped to have done justice to was an island floating in the sky. Yes, there were cattails and reeds. It was plainly a pond, but the water was so mirror-like that clouds appeared perched beneath the island's tall grasses and scrubby trees. He tempered his excitement. The creation he put the most thought and energy into was never the one that impressed anyone. In class the next day, Lee developed his film and clipped it up to dry. The images looked promising, but everything looked sharp at such a small size. He had learned not to pore over the negatives too obsessively. The real test would come the next day when he made prints, and he knew right away which shots he was going to use. At home that night, Lee finished the last of the cookies before going to bed. He was sure he'd hear something about it in the morning. When he got up, though, Mother had already left for work. Today he could go through his bag lunch and screen it for any embarrassing notes without any chance of being caught. He'd rather have prepared it himself, but he wasn't about to have that guilt-drenched talk again. Speaking of which, there was the note, complete with a frowny face and something about how there were no more cookies to include. After the walk and waddle to school, after morning classes, and after another turn in the darkroom, Lee's prints were ready. There was always a little crowd when he laid out his photos, and pretty quickly the reactions started. No laughs for the drunken shadow. "Oh, wow! Do you see it?" "What? Where? How did you do that? Is that a double exposure? It looks real." Lee was looking over the same pictures as his classmates and quite puzzled as to what they were talking about. He needed an answer, quickly, but somehow he was missing something astonishing in one of his own prints. "The bridge below." Lee almost didn't recognize Amy's voice. She sounded so somber, so serious all of a sudden. But then he saw what everyone else had seen. His floating island was a show of reflection, all right. In the water, clear as day, was the reflection of a stonework bridge, corresponding to no actual structure. Not only did Lee have no answer, he had the same questions as everyone else, though he dared not voice them. Is it there but underwater? It can't be. You can't see underwater anywhere else. Come on, how'd you do that? Did you not notice it before? That was good enough. He was going to end up looking foolish anyway. Maybe he could cut his losses. I really didn't. I just wanted to show the clouds in the water. I wasn't even looking over there. That didn't seem to satisfy anybody, but the questions stopped. Mrs. Jenkins even looked puzzled. Lee had quickly imagined a dozen reactions ranging from uproarious mocking laughter to burning his pictures, to burning him at the stake. He was glad people didn't act like that outside his imagination. Then he was embarrassed for imagining such things at all. Then he was embarrassed for being embarrassed about things nobody else knew. After school, as they agreed, Lee met some of his photography classmates at Hidden Oaks Park. They made their way to the pond and Jason saw it first. Holy crap, it really looks like that. What? How is that even possible? Everyone looked to Lee as if to accuse him of holding out, of hiding some big secret. I just took a picture. You know everything I do. Several kids circled around, staring at the reflected image of the bridge, glancing up at where the real thing would have been, must have been, but wasn't. Mike found a long stick and poked down into the water. The stick found no bridge, no stone, no rigging, only water, and eventually silt. Its only effect was to ripple the water and distort, but not destroy, the reflection. Lee didn't see who, but someone threw a rock, sploosh, right into the pond, just beside where the phantom bridge should have been. Another too far. Lee looked over to see Amy throw a stone directly ahead of herself. No splash, no miss, just a dull crack as her rock struck and bounced off of nothing, and landed on the weedy island beyond. All eyes shot back to Amy, who herself was staring intensely at the reflection. Stop, she said. Let the water settle down. They did. Amy didn't really hang out with anybody in this class, and everyone had been a bit surprised she'd come with. But she had that serious air about her again. Something sincere. In the center of a group of teenagers, sincerity would have been an open invitation, a lightning rod for snickering and mockery. Only now, none of them were sure enough of anything to jeer. When the water was mostly still again, Amy began slowly walking towards the pond. The group's silence intensified as Amy walked up and over the water. Her reflection, a lanky girl standing on a stone bridge, made sense. Her actual self and her position above the pond did not. Oh my God! No friggin' way! What? Amy turned to face the others. A tiny smile came to her, and she looked down. That seemed to disorient her, and she ducked down quickly to keep from falling. Both shoes and now both hands were in contact with nothing. But well above the water she remained. For a moment everything was still. Amy closed her eyes and looked peaceful. Everybody began mulling in her direction with equal measures of curiosity and caution. Everybody but Lee. He felt like another one of his mind's eye stories was unfolding. Amy's eyes opened wide. The serenity of seconds ago had completely drained from her face. Lee had never seen such urgency and alarm on someone's face before. Her eyes were radiating pure terror. "Run! Leave now!" she shouted. Her voice was not her own. It was not the voice of any young person. This voice was made not of sound but of emptiness and ruin. Lee's gaze darted one way then another, looking, searching, begging for all this to be in his sick, childish head. A glance at his classmates' faces as they fled drew a quick consensus. This was not imaginary. As they scrambled away, however, the world around Amy shrank and became still. "Run!" Amy shouted again, puncturing the quiet. Lee was the only one left. He couldn't run, he couldn't help, he couldn't do anything but watch. A breeze picked up. It felt as if somehow the island was breathing in. The water rippled, and the reflected girl squatting on the reflected bridge shimmered. "Ow!" Amy pulled up one hand with a jolt. Her palm and fingertips were bleeding, torn open. She let out a more urgent scream as she tried to lift her other hand but couldn't. The breeze paused, then picked up again. If before the island had been inhaling, it was now letting out a deep sigh. Amy's screams grew more painful and were joined by horrible screeching and grinding noises. Her shoes were smoking, being shredded and burned away while she was in them. Her left hand, still stuck in place, was mostly gone. Down into nothingness. The water rippled in the breeze. The reflections tore and wiggled in a gentle chaos. Amy, screaming in agony, was falling into nothing, and the nothing was consuming her, decompiling bone and flesh and making awful, unnatural noises in doing so. No amount of effort could wrench her legs free. Soon her legs were gone. Soon after that, she could no longer scream. Soon after that, only her bleeding, wide-eyed, mortified face remained, and in another moment, that too had screeched out of existence. After what may have been a second or might have been an hour of nothing but gentle breeze, Lee blinked and looked down. He was alone. At a spot he used to love, in a park he used to enjoy. In his hands was one of the school's cameras. The exposure counter suggested one photograph had been taken. Lee removed the camera's strap from his neck, dropped it where he stood, and went home. Lee didn't go to Hidden Oaks again after that day. There were no more stories about mercantile ants or castles. There were only nightmares, repeating the gruesome sights and sounds of poor Amy, being taken apart into her ingredients, broken down further and further, never to be whole again. In the more cruel versions of the nightmare, Lee himself was the oblivion that devoured her. "You'll never make it. This is a mercy." The number 10 Metro Transit line went from downtown Minneapolis to the north-central suburbs. It ran north on Central Avenue all the way to Fridley, where it would cross west on Osborne Road in front of Unity Hospital, only to go back south toward Minneapolis on University. Pete had been driving this route on the evening shift for more than 2 decades by 1999. His regular passengers knew his eccentric ways and would no longer bat an eye at his unusual actions. In fact, some of them enjoyed watching these quirks as though they were a theatrical event. But newcomers to his bus would often stare, mouth agape, at his singular tactics. Pete had honed to a masterfully crafted art form, the science of being an asshole. He was a short Filipino man in his late 50s with cropped gray hair. As always, he looked extremely well put together. He was dressed in an immaculately pressed white shirt with a snugly tucked black tie. If any passenger dared question his actions, he would rip off his ever-present sunglasses in a flourish to enhance his dramatic statements. If someone was unfortunate enough to invoke this reaction, he would stare at them with his famous, "That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard," squint of disappointment, generally until they got uncomfortable enough to either get off the bus or surrender quietly into a seat. Then he would replace the glasses and drive on. One of his most singular behaviors was his habit of bringing the bus to a complete stop regardless of the surrounding traffic or his lane position. Then he would crack open a can of Surge with a hiss, loudly chug the entire beverage, and give a loud "ah" after he finished, before crushing the can in his fist, tossing it into the garbage bin behind his seat, and putting the bus back into gear. It was Saturday, July 24th, and the evening was passing on as usual. No issues with the route, no issues with passengers, no issues with the bus, just as on any other day. Pete would never dream of using the loudspeaker microphone. He would simply turn his head slightly and bellow out at the top of his lungs the current stop, 4th Street! Came the shout from the front seat. Several of the passengers in the front few rows jumped as this happened. The bus slowed to a stop and the doors opened. A handful of passengers exited the bus, and 2 more got on. One of the women who sat in the second row scooted to the edge of her seat and called up to him in a soft tone, asking which stop she should use to get to the Walker Arts Center. Pete peered up in the mirror at the woman and shouted, "What am I, a map?" He continued driving and she looked down at her lap, feeling defeated and pulling into herself. The bus drove on, stopping at the next street. There were 3 people at the stop, 2 of which promptly walked onto the vehicle's platform as the doors were opened for them. The third man, who was reading a book, took perhaps 3 seconds to place his bookmark on his current page before he began to step forward to enter the doors. "Nope!" shouted Pete, slamming the doors in the man's face and driving off without hesitation. As he drove, he turned completely around to face those passengers in the seats just to his right and behind him. This was another regular behavior of his, imparting his bus-driving nuggets of wisdom to his passengers, whom never thought to ask for them. "You're either on or you're off," he said in his reedy voice. "You've got to pay attention." Those who knew this routine just continued about their business. One man, dressed in a business suit and clutching his briefcase against his lap in a terrified death grip, who was clearly new to these shenanigans, said in a shaky voice, "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The passengers in the front seats also noticed that the forsaken man who had been reading at the bus stop was running directly alongside. A couple of times, he banged on the side of the bus, apparently demanding that it let him in. The next stop was only a block away, and the man's dead run allowed him to make the stop at nearly the same time as the bus, which was driving in city traffic. When Pete opened the doors, the man literally jumped in and climbed the steps in a huff. "You left me back there," he shouted at Pete, trying to catch his breath. The driver turned to the man, whipped off his sunglasses, and stared at him for a matter of seconds. After looking him up and down and watching the man's confidence fade before him, he asked in a gruff, questioning tone, "Who are you?" The man's shoulders deflated along with his anger at the driver and confidence in himself, and he slowly shuffled to a seat halfway down the bus. Following this, Pete seemed a bit distracted as he drove on. He went several blocks without stopping, clearly missing at least 2 or 3 stops in the interim. The pull cord signaling that someone wished to get off was pulled several times, chiming in the front of the bus to alert the driver. When he finally did decide to stop the bus again, an elderly lady made her way to the front. She stopped beside the driver's seat and turned to Pete, saying, "Sir, I think you missed my stop a few blocks back." Pete turned to her and whipped off his sunglasses, staring her down. "I've been doing this route for 25 years, he growled. They looked at one another for a few moments before she turned, walked down the stairs, and made her way back toward her stop 2 blocks north. Such was every evening bus route with Pete, and so were the passengers routinely passed beneath his scorn, derisions, and dismissals. These tactics had their benefits, however, for both the driver and the passengers. Pete was efficient and nearly always on time. In addition to that, there were rarely any scuffles, arguments, fights, or other crimes under his supervision. Everyone knew from a very early acquaintance with Pete that he would not put up with any misbehavior. The evening went on unremarkably. The sun began to set. A big summer thunderstorm approached from the east. Passengers got on. Passengers got off. The crowd on the bus began to thin. Pete found himself on Central Avenue, heading back north for the last time of the day. This was the final stop on Central. He stopped and 2 passengers got off the bus. He closed the door and looked up in the mirror. No one was left for now. All he had to do was head back down to Minneapolis one last time and his shift would be over. He could hang up his hat for another day. He was always happy when the day went smoothly, and it almost always did. He drove up to the light, taking a left, heading west on Osborne Road. He stopped at the covered bus bench in front of Unity Hospital, more going through the motions than paying any attention. No one was at the stop. A light rain had begun, and when he opened the doors, the cool breeze refreshed him from the stuffy atmosphere of the bus. He decided now was a good time to enjoy his last surge of the day. He turned to his left and dug the soda pop out of the bag next to his seat. He would have heard the coins as they dropped into the fare box next to him. However, at that same instant, he was quickly and loudly cracking open the can of Surge and immediately starting to guzzle it down before turning to face the road again. Ah! He exhaled after finishing the soda. He crushed the can and tossed it back into the bin where it rattled on his other cans, the only trash in the container. He turned north again from this stop, the last several blocks north before heading back south on University Avenue. It was then that the rain suddenly grew heavier. Pete increased the speed of the windshield wipers to keep up. Very quickly, he found he had them on full and was still having a difficult time seeing.
Shit, this is some weather,
chuckled Pete.
Probably won't be anyone needing a ride either.
He slowed his driving as it became more and more difficult to see. He couldn't tell where he needed to turn, but the streetlights on Old Highway 10 would light up the intersection well enough that he would know where he was. The streetlights he did see, however, began to look more and more strange. It almost appeared that he was looking into a kaleidoscope every time he passed by one. The shifting patterns and colors caused by the passing cars were dazzling his sight, and he began to feel strangely disoriented. He knew he was going slow because of the rain, but he felt like he should have found his turn by now. Another 2 minutes and he knew he had missed it. He started to get nervous, feeling foolish that he might have missed a turn, despite the weather. As he always said,
I've been driving this route for 25 years.
And he had. Missing a turn was not something Pete would do. He glanced back in the mirror for a second and looked back at the road, but, in shock, suddenly did a double take back up to the mirror. Halfway down the row of seats directly behind him, there was a black cat with shining white eyes staring back at him. It was sitting on top of the back of a seat just as casually as could be.
No cats on the bus,
shouted the driver, half expecting the cat to slink away like any other scorned passenger. He looked back at the road, intending on finding a good spot to stop so he could kick the cat off the bus, and he suddenly realized he was now sure he didn't know where he was. There were no streetlights, no cross streets, no houses, no other cars. All he could see in the headlights of his own bus between beats of the wiper blades were vast, wild woods stretching off as far as his lights would reach. The light played upon them in colored and fragmented patterns as though the glass over his headlights had become stained glass windows. The sight was dizzying. He took his foot off the gas pedal without the usual feeling of the bus beginning to coast. He placed it on the brake and applied pressure while attempting to turn the wheel to the right to both slow the bus and pull off to the side of the road. Neither action worked. The wheel didn't turn, the brake didn't press, and the bus actually began to speed up. He could hear the engine raise in pitch as it throttled forward more. He hadn't pushed the gas. Pete began to feel terrified. He had always been in complete control of his bus, his route, and his passengers, and now, in an instant, all that control was lost. He couldn't turn, he couldn't stop, he didn't know where he was. Just as he was about to scream and try to open the door to desperately jump out and abandon ship, the bell cord chimed, signaling that a passenger wished to exit the bus. Automatically, the bus pulled to the side of the road and stopped, while simultaneously, the doors opened. Pete sat there, trying to catch his breath as the black cat with the white eyes walked calmly up to the front of the bus with its tail high in the air. It brushed up against his leg in a friendly gesture as if to say, "Thank you for the ride," before lightly loping down the steps and out of the bus. He stared at it over his sunglasses, which had fallen down his nose. As it walked out of sight, he noticed a brown wooden sign with yellow lettering just outside the door. Hidden Oaks Park, City of New Brighton, the sign said. Pete sat staring at the sign, completely bewildered. For once, it was as if the world had whipped off its sunglasses and given him the "that's the stupidest thing I've heard" glare. As he caught his breath, ready to just head back to the depot, he felt a wave of relief. He at least knew where he was now, and he wasn't that far off his route. Because of the weather and his lost time, maybe he wouldn't even complete the rest of the stops after this. Just call it a day. He put his hand on the handle to pull the doors closed when he heard a faint, musical but discordant chiming sound begin to grow. Just before he shut the doors, he looked back up in the mirror. The fear that had driven its icy stake through his heart came back tenfold from what it had been before. There in the mirror, rushing toward him at full speed, was a monstrous, dark shape. It was tall and would have been nearly touching the ceiling of the bus if it hadn't been hunched forward in its dash. It was jagged and sharp at its edges, and it rippled as though it were made of tattered fabric. He flinched heavily as it stopped beside him briefly to change direction and exit the bus. Its dark claw rested on the door pull handle as it did so, just atop his own hand. It felt both icy cold, sharply hot, and had a stinging electrical buzz to it when it connected with him. He gave out a short cry and caught a glimpse of the grotesque shadowed horns protruding from what might have been its head. The thing dashed away from him, but paused again at the doors. It was darker black than the stormy night outside. It turned to stare at him, and he felt a dark, sinister chuckle deep within his brain. Then, the being shattered like a dropped mirror. Though the monstrous vision was gone, and he would pass the rest of this night normally, Pete's mind would be troubled with memories of that sight for the rest of his life. Something so sinister, so unnatural could not be seen without sparking the beginnings of madness in a human's mind. With a violently shaking hand, he again reached up to the door pull handle. It took him several tries to get the doors closed. He was weak with fear. He closed them, and as his paralysis broke, he drove off at twice the speed limit, not obeying a single stop sign or traffic light, all the way back to the Minneapolis bus depot. The man was still in a bit of disbelief about what had happened to him. He'd had a heart attack, been in a hospital, had surgery, the whole smorgasbord of health trauma, but none of it really weighed on him sitting there on the bed, staring at the brown hospital door. He could hear the doctor talking to his children just outside of it. He'd known what was being said by the doctor, because his own conscience was telling him the same thing. He was too sick to leave the hospital. His recovery was not complete. It didn't matter, though. He needed to do it. He had to get to the woods and descend. No doubt nightmares had become reality around there since his ailment. He was at least a full cycle late on containment. The hospital room had a whiteboard just below the television that faced his bed. Each time the nurse updated the date with a blue, squeaky, dry erase marker, a corner of his heart wanted to crawl into his stomach. The man was wearing a pair of light blue jeans and a white shirt his kids had brought from his house. They were both clean and without holes and rips. He hadn't even known that he owned clothes that lacked either at this point. It was nice of them to be here. He knew it had been horrible being his children, especially for his son. He'd never wanted them to have this right, this curse. But instead of telling them about it, he'd simply acted out with frustration over this predestination. Deep inside, he wanted them to be whoever they truly were, to live their own lives, unfettered by this awful burden. He did not want there to be this ancient limitation. He wanted to protect them from it as long as possible. The man blinked himself back to reality and stood up slowly from the bed. It was early afternoon. The air smelled like chemicals and linen. Outside the door in the hallways there were beeps of machines and chatter among people. The walls seemed endless when he arrived, but they really were quite small. There was one window which looked outside over a small courtyard with solemn trees and a few concrete planters. A few times he'd woken up in the middle of the night. He thought he saw someone smiling at him from the shadows caught between the moon and the sky. Just a row of teeth, maybe a pair of eyes. It reminded him of something, but his memory and concentration were fogged ever since the heart attack. He'd lost some weight, too. His clothes looked a little baggy on his frame. His skin was extra pale and peaked, like it wasn't quite sure it wanted to be attached to his ill body anymore. He staggered slightly, over to the door. He didn't want to look back at the hospital room. Despite having this cardiac episode, it felt good to be cared for in this manner. He missed it. His father was so good at it. Why couldn't he have been?
"I'm ready,"
he said, opening the door. The man said nothing to the nurse standing opposite of his two children in the hallway. He'd spoken to them enough. He wobbled past them. Without looking up, he nodded his head and grunted. He was already exhausted from this short trip from the peach-colored room to the white hallway with a variety of beds and monitors lining its walls. What are you doing?
Going home.
We're not here to pick you up. You shouldn't be out of bed right now, let alone out of the hospital. Look at you.
God damn it, Eddie.
What? Were you not listening to the nurse just because they can't force him to stay?
Had about enough of that man nurse. What does he know?
Medicine. He knows medicine, and you don't.
Dad, let's just take a minute, all right?
I...
Put that down for a second.
It's good you both came.
Oh, of course. Right?
Right.
Dad, please, sit down. Eddie, he should sit down.
You should listen to her. And to the staff.
I can't stay here any longer. I have things to take care of.
Can we just talk? Here, sit down. What is it that you need to take care of?
Yes, I need to tell you, but not here, not now.
Sure. Not now that we're all together for the first time.
Hey now. Eddie, can you close the... what's wrong?
Nothing. Just, it felt like... I thought I saw that creepy cat from outside the house, out of the corner of my eye. Forget it. I'm just tired.
She's up to something. What's the cat doing here? Get it away.
No, Dad, there is no cat here.
It was, wasn't it?
What? How would that cat get all the way...
Saw you too. We have to go.
You're not in any condition to go home.
I think we should stay here. For a little bit longer, at least. There's just some things we want to talk about.
Quit it, both of you. You don't get what you want. I don't either, not that that's ever mattered. We're going. Now.
At least let us find you a wheelchair.
Let him walk. Here, give me that.
I can carry.
I've got it. Eddie couldn't remember the last time they'd all ridden in the car together anywhere. It had to have been years, but he didn't want to focus on how many or how long ago. Never had he driven with his father in the back seat. The drive was quiet, rainy, and gray. Stoplights meshed and curled around raindrops pattered along the windshield. The defroster buzzed against the glass. The radio was off. Eddie knew it was a bad idea to play any music. His father would just tell him to turn it off. His father had never really liked any of his interests. When he was younger, he was an avid fan of all science fiction. If the story had a robot, spaceship, or laser gun, he was there. Books, movies, television shows, it didn't matter. Eddie was obsessed with it. His mother nourished it with trips to Walden Books at Northtown Mall, movies from Sam Goody, or comics from Schindler's. He loved that side of his personality. His father, who was obsessed with westerns, hated it and would turn off the television in the midst of any Star Trek episode Eddie was watching. When he moved out to California just after his mother's death, Eddie had gone back and forth in waves of interest with these bits of geekdom. His interest usually correlated with how much therapy he was currently receiving. The counseling sessions made him more comfortable in his own identity. Recently, he'd been enjoying the Sci-Fi Channel. Every Saturday morning, there would be Japanimation films on after Mystery Science Theater 3000. He loved every second of those stories, especially the futuristic ones with metal cities as far as the eye could see. A literal buffet of skyscrapers reaching up toward the heavens in solid stalks of man-made luminescence. The rain reminded him of them. There were always scenes where the main character would drive or ride through a storm, the falling water muting all the sharp and industrial details into some sort of impressionist painting of a cityscape. Strangely, as his imagination allowed him to escape the awkwardness of simply being around his father, the road around him started to change. They were just about to drive past Hidden Oaks Park. His sister, in the back beside their father, was completely asleep. She had this natural skill during moments of stress or tension. Despite her best intentions, she would simply fall asleep. It was as if her mind and body were rebelling against the passive-aggressive reality around her. Dreams, whether short or long, were better than being around this traumatic family dynamic. Eddie's hands gripped the steering wheel more tightly, the more the street changed. Gone was the gray road, reflecting the glowing trees and leaves of summer, which seemed brighter against the dull, wet backdrop. A sweet smell filled the car. It then changed to the sourness of gasoline and the rot of sewers. The trees, church, tennis courts, and even the sky folded away from itself as though it were made of paper. The flattened pieces crawled and vanished into slits in the ground, like worms scared away by the beak of a bird. The image remaining to Eddie's unblinking eyes would be burned into his past, present, and future memories. In an earthly groan, towering structures rose out of the ground. The terrain looked like it was getting peeled apart from the inside, like someone ripping open a slice of bread. A metropolis bloomed alongside them. It towered past where Eddie could see from the windows. Colors flashed in the rows of square and round windows. They were bright, diverse, like the entire light spectrum was locked inside. Machines like spiders crawled along rectangles of metal and concrete. A spaceship shot overhead, racing the car toward the end of the street. A zeppelin clad in spikes and screens peeked its head out from behind luminous shapes. There was some sort of house beaming on those bright panels. It looked familiar to Eddie, but he'd never seen it before. Despite this eruption of metropolitan energy, there were no further sounds coming through the windows, not since all this had originated. It was eerily silent, except for a strange bit of music that was playing by itself on the radio. Eddie could not move his body, or the car. It was almost as if he were on some sort of carnival ride. He had no control over anything. At the end of the road stood a black bridge curled in the air. It seemed high and far away, but also low enough that he might drive into it. It looked like it had a railing across its arch, but that was the only detail. Something was standing on it. The form was tall, shrouded, and growing into the array of reflecting light from the blossoming city. It was almost like a pair of wings was opening, but there wasn't enough symmetry to define them thus. The ephemeral music became a curious song. Eddie's skin felt light. He could feel his body drifting backwards into the corridor of light he'd just passed through.
Feel free to stop,
his father said, sternly from the back seat. He didn't even know his dad was there, much less awake. Eddie came to an abrupt stop that sent water sizzling away from the tires in diagonal streaks. It was the stop sign just beyond Hidden Oaks Park. The music was gone.
What did you see?
His father said. What? Oh, nothing, just daydreaming, he replied. His father sighed and shuffled in the back seat.
She's reaching out to the next generation already.
What are you talking about? Eddie replied. His father sighed and knocked on the window with his fist as he turned backwards at the forest. Twisting his neck was hard for his weakened body. It made his vision blur. Nothing but quiet trees beneath some wandering rain clouds stared back at him. There was so much more watching him. Then, for a single moment, he was back on that black road winding through her illusion that scared him so long ago. He could still hear her voice in the back seat, firing off every flare of fear inside his reptilian brain.
They don't get any easier.
Eddie didn't say anything more to his father, especially after the strange vision of the metal buildings and the sky bridge. When they got back to their childhood home, their dad wandered into his bedroom to rest his eyes. He could barely walk, form sentences, or lift his head up. Ellie seemed distant while they settled in for the night. Neither of them had anything to say while in their parents' shadow. After a moment of settling in, they realized that their father wasn't going to reappear from his bedroom anytime soon. The rain was letting up, at least for the moment. The small suburban house was filled with physical and emotional clutter and increasingly stuffy air. Ellie stepped out the sliding door from the kitchen into the small backyard. As a space to clear her head, it was a bit lacking. Odds and ends of lumber, appliance parts, varieties of bricks, barrels, and tarps competed for space with overgrown grass and weeds. A half-dozen partially completed handyman projects, some probably guessable, and others much more vexing, found themselves in various degrees of completion and exposure to the elements. Parts of the yard were so completely shaded by a few thickly overgrown trees that only a few tufts of flora dotted large patches of dirt, currently home to some good-sized puddles. It wasn't all disrepair. Ellie remembered playing, jumping in puddles as a child in those same dirt patches. It didn't feel so long ago at all. Absent-mindedly, she walked out from under the awning, through the drizzle and over towards the spot where a natural depression always collected the biggest puddle. That hadn't changed. She didn't remember any puddle ever being so clear, though. As she paced nearer, it looked like a perfect mirror. From its edge, she could make clear eye contact with herself. Gabriella. The baby reflected in the puddle was born and named Gabriella. It was only once she started talking and walking that people started calling her Ella. Ellie didn't remember that herself. Yards away were the only two people in the world who would know for sure. She'd nearly lost one, and the other... No, this wasn't about them. They always made everything about themselves. Maybe all men did that. But right now it was just Ellie, and little Gabriella turned Ella in her rain puddle. She began circling slowly. Ella was now Ellie. She had gone by either, but when she started school, almost everyone called her Ellie, so that stuck. She glanced away for a second to avoid a large stick as she made her way around. When her gaze returned to her reflection, it seemed that whatever magic had been at work was finished. Ellie's reflection matched her current self exactly. But as she continued, her reflection aged. Wrinkles formed and flesh sagged at a disarming rate. Ellie had to hold her hands out to check and make sure she still had her youth. She did. And in a manner of speaking, so did her reflection. Her arms were extended also, but holding her hand was Ella. She bent down for a closer look, but from this perspective, her younger reflection obscured her older one. As she completed her circuit, Ellie was still somewhat crouched, just like her white-haired, frail reflection. But now, her eyes would no longer meet across the reflection. Below the puddle, elderly Ellie's gaze was fixed on the bundle in her arms. Baby Gabriella. The rain had picked up again, and some drops finally found their way through the thick maze of leaves above. Ella's reflections rippled away. She was starting to get wet, so she quickly returned to the back door. Her intent to step out for some air and relax hadn't worked out exactly as expected, but she smiled as she thought to herself. At least her little break had lasted a lifetime. Eddie couldn't relax in the house. It was all just too close, too uncomfortable. Too much had already come back too quickly. Ellie had wandered off somewhere, and he didn't want to sit in here by himself anymore while the old man slept. He picked up his jean jacket from the top of a pile of Hot Pockets boxes that was next to the couch and put it on as he walked out the front door. The rain continued to come down, but it wasn't very heavy at the moment. The raindrops that landed on his hair and face as he walked to the front of the garage felt alive in some way. Like water was extra wet, and the drops were gliding down his face to a purpose. To meet with the rest of their friends and join together to form a powerful rushing river leading to the sea. It was as if he could feel their determination. Eddie walked over to the front of the garage, where he could stand under the overhang and smoke, while still being out of sight of any windows into the house. He really didn't like people seeing him smoke, especially anyone he cared about. It made him feel ashamed of the dirty habit. He pulled a cigarette out of the pack and replaced it in his breast pocket. He also pulled out the Zippo lighter that he had found the day before as he and his sister explored their father's junkyard of a house. It lit on the first turn of its wheel. The heat of the flame played over the greasy, humid feeling on his face. He inhaled deeply as the tobacco took hold of the flame, and he felt the calm start to come over him. As he stood there, he let his mind fall into this moment. He took the time to just mentally sit in his nothing box, which is how he always thought of it. Not thinking about anything in particular, just passing time. He had too much on his mind and just wanted to escape. He started to look around. Even for a gray day, the colors were extraordinarily vivid. The green of the plants struck out at him like an electric light show. The slight breeze grazed his face and cooled the dampness. He closed his eyes for a moment to take in this sensation. As he did, his other senses became stronger. He could smell the ozone scent of a thunderstorm. He could smell the wet earth and something bitter like pond scum. When he opened them again, he was looking ahead of him down the driveway. There was a large puddle that had grown just several feet out from where he was standing. Eddie hadn't noticed it before. He was puzzled as he looked at it. He thought the driveway had been almost completely flat. When he was out here yesterday with his sister, he didn't notice any divots or unlevel areas. He took another drag on his cigarette and reached down to pick up a golf ball-sized rock that was sitting by his feet. He tossed the rock in a lazy arc right into the middle of the puddle. It landed with the plump sound that objects make when thrown into deep water. Ripples spread across its surface and then quickly dissipated, and the puddle was still again. He noticed that even raindrops were not disturbing it, even though it continued to rain lightly. His brow furrowed and he took a few tentative steps forward, not taking his eyes off the puddle. "What the hell?" he asked no one in particular. He leaned over it as he approached, pulling hard on his cigarette as he did so. At first he saw the reflection of his hair and forehead as he leaned, but as his full figure came into view, the image changed suddenly. Just as in a reflection of a mirror across from another mirror. Hundreds or thousands of Eddie reflections arced back into an endless curve. Eddie stared transfixed at the image, eyes widening. He heard a song start to play in the back of his mind. Then, just as the music began to increase in volume, he heard a distant and strange rushing sound. He felt a breeze blow up at him, seemingly coming from the puddle itself. The breeze was hot and dry, and he saw a reddish light starting to grow from the far distance of the reflected curve. The wind and heat increased, and he started to see flames lick the distant arc of repeating reflections. Just as the heat started to get intense, he was able to break his trance and stand upright. He tossed his cigarette into the puddle and the ripples broke the image. Very quickly, and on jittery legs, he turned around and walked back into the house, slamming the door shut behind him. He fastened all 5 of the deadbolts on the front door and then leaned against it, breathing heavily. Their father didn't plan to fall asleep for as long as he did. His body was betraying him. They all said he wasn't ready to go home at the hospital. He might risk some complications. Even minor exertions were threats to his frail body. His mind wasn't completely there either. It felt like there was a delay between his thoughts and actions, like his inner monologue had an echo. In truth, he always had a fog of depression in his life. His role in the ritual, his obligation to her containment, it had bred thousands of insecurities in the very network of his identity. His kids had made the bed for him. They'd found an old navy blue comforter that was sort of scratchy, like the stuff one might sleep on in a cheap hotel. Still, it was clean and much better than the oily sheets from before. He smiled from this gesture. His lips were dry. They split open. The doctor had told him to stay hydrated as he recovered. He had barely listened. Containing her was the top priority, and he was far behind on the incantations. A little nap wouldn't hurt, though, as long as he could see through her illusions. He had the lantern, which would drive every nightmare away like cockroaches under the kitchen light. As long as he had it, he'd be okay. He was tired enough to not remember sprawling onto his back. All he could feel from between resting and waking was someone putting the blanket over his body. This made him smile, even in his sleep. In his dreams, he went back to the diner, the morning his father told him about her, his role, and the family itself. He'd been there many times before. Some were pleasant memories recycled into his subconscious. Other moments were from her, communicating with him cryptically from that pit. This was one of those moments. It was the same type of morning as when it all started. It was before dawn, and there was a rampant murkiness to the sky, like some sort of cartoonish storm cloud. He expected the restaurant to be lit up and sparkling in the gloom, but it was dark and deserted. There were no sounds or smells outside the structure. No trees brushing against the breeze, no crickets carving songs out against the vast inkiness. The man couldn't tell what body he had, but his instinct told him that in this vision, he was back to being a child, when his father first exposed him to this living nightmare. He stared at the long building and its many windows. There was a shape sitting in one of the booths just inside the window pane on the far end. He quickly walked up to the door. Strangely, there was an open sign hanging on the front of it, even though it was clearly closed. He pulled the door ajar without even wanting to, but these visions had their own sense of motion, cause, and effect. Inside there was dust everywhere, in all directions. The ceiling, floor, counters, booths, stools, and walls were covered in a gritty, thick layer of milky sediment. It looked completely undisturbed, except for a single trail of footprints leading to the last seat on the left. His eyes followed them like a treasure map. The man recoiled with what he saw. Sitting there nonchalantly was a hooded shape. He couldn't focus on it completely. There wasn't any particular feature to focus on. The depths of surrounding shadows were assisting it, moving it in and out of his sight. It made him sick to gaze at it, even though he was without his real body. On top of the table, one feature jumped up at him. It was unobscured, uninterrupted, and clear. A massive, six-fingered hand was resting there. He screamed and started to backpedal. A jukebox behind him lit up and started to stutter a random melody of music. There was a howl from somewhere, and laughter. The diner started to squeeze and tighten all around him. The floor billowed up, causing him to stagger toward the form at the table. The closer he got, the more truth appeared. It was her. He knew it. Then the man was awake in his bed. He could feel his sweat stinging him through the sheets with dampness. The smell of salt from his pores was on the air. It was early morning. His body still felt fatigued and weak. Before he could move or start to collect his things, he shook his head with disbelief.
Is she free?
He said, staring up at the ceiling. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The story Reflection, written by Owen Swerkstrom. Round and Round by Robert Dawn. And The Rain Has Come by Patrick Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The voice of Hidden Oaks and Eddie, performed by Robert Dawn. The voice of Ellie, performed by Robin Sand. The voice of the father, performed by Owen Swerkstrom. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.